Dust hung in the air as I stood there watching an SUV grind straight through my ranch gate for the third time that month. Metal shrieked. Hinges tore loose. Gravel sprayed across my boots. Behind the wheel was Brenda Halvorsen, the self-appointed board leader of Cedar Bluff HOA, gripping the steering wheel like the land belonged to her. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from pure disbelief. She didn't stop. She didn't apologize. She leaned out the window and shouted that my gate was illegal, that I was blocking community access. That was when I noticed the phones. 2 neighbors standing back, filming. This wasn't enforcement. It was a performance. I lifted my own phone, slow and steady, checked the timestamp, and zoomed in. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I already knew what she didn't. Every inch of that road sat on a recorded easement older than her HOA, older than her house, older than her authority. She drove off laughing, leaving my gate twisted in the dirt. Just before disappearing, she tossed one last line over her shoulder. "You'll hear from us." I had no idea that was only the opening move. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files Stories, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before Cedar Bluff ever had a name, before newsletters and board meetings and enforcement letters, there was just land and time. My parcel is narrow and long, a strip that bends around what eventually became the subdivision. My father bought it in 1978, back when the road was dirt and the only sounds at night were insects and cattle shifting in their sleep. The deed came with a recorded access easement, surveyed, notarized, and filed cleanly with the county. It wasn't a favor. It wasn't temporary. It was part of the land itself. That easement was how we moved livestock. It was how utility crews reached the back lines. It was how we accessed our own property without asking permission from anyone. For decades, nobody questioned it. Ranchers, county workers, even the first developers all respected the line because it was obvious, documented, and older than all of us. Life out there ran on routine. Gates opened and closed. Fences got mended. Mornings started early and ended quiet. That mattered to me, especially after my father passed and the responsibility became mine. Cedar Bluff arrived slowly at first. A few model homes, then rows of identical rooftops. Mailers promising community living and managed beauty. I watched it from a distance, not bitter, not curious, just aware. Growth happens. Land changes. As long as lines are respected, people can coexist. That's when Brenda Halvorsen appeared. At the beginning, she didn't look like trouble. She introduced herself as organized, community-minded, the kind of person who carried a clipboard and smiled while doing it. She waved when we crossed paths. She talked about safety and shared values. I nodded, stayed polite, and kept my distance. I never joined the HOA. I didn't need to. My land wasn't part of it, and legally, it never could be. The first sign something was off came in the form of a laminated notice, zip-tied to my gate. It was labeled a courtesy reminder, suggesting I coordinate access with the board because my gate affected community flow. It wasn't a demand, but it wasn't a question either. I removed it and went back to work. A week later, Brenda stopped by unannounced. She smiled the whole time, eyes scanning past me like she was already measuring something. She said the board had concerns. She suggested my gate was outdated. She used words like shared access and community use, as if repeating them might make them real. I told her calmly that the road was protected by a recorded easement. She nodded, still smiling, and said they would look into it. More notices followed. Suggestions to coordinate, invitations to meetings I didn't belong to. Brenda always stayed pleasant, but there was an edge to it, a confidence that felt premature. She talked the way people do when they think paperwork is on their side. At home, my daughter Lily helped me keep things running. She checked fence lines, fed animals, and asked questions that mattered. She wanted to know why strangers kept coming near the gate. She wanted to know if we were in trouble. I told her no. I believe that. What I cared about wasn't control or pride. It was stability. This land wasn't a flex or a statement. It was responsibility passed down, and I treated it that way. Boundaries weren't about exclusion. They were about safety and order. Still, something didn't sit right. After the second gate incident and the steady drip of pressure, I decided to do the sensible thing. I drove to the county office, not angry, not confrontational. I just wanted reassurance. I wanted to see the record with my own eyes, the way I always had. The clerk pulled the old files first. There it was. The original deed. The 1978 survey. The easement clearly marked, clean lines, no ambiguity. I felt a familiar calm. This was solid. Then she pulled the newer plats. At first, I thought I was reading it wrong. I leaned closer. Traced the lines with my finger. The easement was gone. Not reduced, not shifted. Erased. In its place was a label I had never seen before. Community Reserve. My stomach dropped. I asked when it was filed. She told me the year. I asked who submitted it. She hesitated before answering. I asked if there were amendments or notices sent to adjacent landowners. There were none. I walked out of that office with copies in my hand and a realization settling in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't overzealous enforcement. Someone had redrawn the map and hoped nobody would notice. And now I understood why Brenda smiled the way she did. The pressure didn't come all at once. It arrived in layers, deliberate and exhausting, like they were trying to see how much weight I'd carry before I broke. The fines were the first thing to multiply. Notices started showing up dated weeks earlier, claiming violations I'd never been informed of. Unauthorized obstruction. Failure to comply. Interference with community infrastructure. Each one came with a dollar amount and a reminder that penalties accrued daily. It wasn't about money. It was about fatigue, about making the problem feel constant. My phone filled with voicemails that all sounded the same. Soft voices. Careful phrasing, just checking in. We're concerned. We want to avoid further action. Every message carried the same unspoken threat: comply or we escalate. Board members began appearing without warning. 2 at a time. Always with clipboards. They'd stand just inside the fence line like they were allowed to be there, pointing, whispering, taking notes. If I stepped outside, they'd switch to smiles and rehearsed lines about procedure and compliance. Then the contractors showed up. They didn't ask permission. They didn't knock. They parked along the road and walked my easement like it was already theirs, pushing stakes into the dirt, spraying paint marks across ground I'd maintained for years. The flags followed the exact line of the erased easement, as precise as a confession. I told them to leave. They told me to talk to the HOA. I called the sheriff after the third unannounced visit. Deputy Nolan Pierce arrived in a cruiser, listened politely, and glanced at the documents I handed him. He didn't even take them from my hands. He said it looked like a civil matter. He said HOAs cause disputes like this all the time. He suggested I work it out. When he drove off, the contractors went right back to marking the ground. That was when the nights changed. I stopped sleeping through them. Every sound outside pulled me awake. Tires on gravel, voices carried by the wind. I started checking the cameras before I checked the weather. I kept my phone on the nightstand with the sound turned up. Lily noticed before I said anything. She asked why strangers kept walking near the road. She asked why letters kept coming. One evening, while we were fixing the fence, she asked me straight out if we were going to lose the road. I told her no. I meant it. But I could hear the strain in my own voice. The stress wasn't loud. It was constant. It sat in the background of everything, turning routine into vigilance. Even simple tasks felt like decisions that might be twisted into violations. Then came the morning that changed everything. I heard the engines before I saw them. Heavy. Slow. Multiple. I stepped outside and saw 2 concrete trucks easing down the road, followed by a flatbed and a pickup with Cedar Bluff logos on the doors. Brenda was already there, standing off to the side in a clean jacket, clipboard tucked under her arm like she was hosting an event. I walked down to the fence and told them to stop. Brenda didn't look at me. She waved the trucks forward and told me this was approved board work. She said the community was installing a decorative monument and information kiosk to mark the entrance. I told her it was my easement. She told me the map said otherwise. The trucks backed into position. Workers unloaded forms and rebar. Stakes. I had watched them placed days earlier suddenly made sense. This wasn't preparation. This was execution. I called the sheriff again. No one came. I stood there filming as they set the forms directly over the easement line. Brenda gave instructions like this was routine, like pouring concrete on land you didn't own was just another line item. Wet cement filled the wooden frames, gray and irreversible. The sound of it hitting the ground felt heavier than it should have. Permanent. Deliberate. I didn't yell. I didn't cross the fence. I filmed everything. The truck logos. The license plates. Brenda's face as she watched it happen. The way she avoided looking at me until the last pour was finished. When the trucks finally pulled away, a fresh slab sat where the easement had been. Smooth. Level. Still wet. They hadn't just crossed the line. They had buried it under concrete and dared me to dig it back out. I stood there long after they left, the air sharp with dust and cement, my phone still recording as the surface began to set. The sun reflected off it like a challenge. That was the moment I understood exactly who I was dealing with. They weren't enforcing rules. They were trying to erase evidence, and they were counting on me to give up before the concrete cured. I didn't sleep the night after the concrete pour. I didn't pace or spiral. I sat at the kitchen table with documents spread out in front of me, replaying the footage frame by frame until something clicked into place. This wasn't a neighbor dispute. It wasn't an HOA overreach. It was a calculated attempt to change the record and force me to surrender by exhaustion. The next morning, I called Thomas Hale. Thomas had been recommended quietly by a retired county clerk who took one look at the newer plat and told me, off the record, that I needed someone who understood how courts think, not just how they argue. Thomas had once been a district judge. Now he practiced privately, mostly for people who needed someone to read between the lines of official paperwork. I laid everything out in his office. The original deed. The 1978 survey. The erased easement. The fines. The footage of Brenda supervising the concrete pour. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He just stared at the plats, comparing dates, tracing the missing line with his finger. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud or dramatic. "This isn't aggressive enforcement," he said. "This is fraud." The word landed heavier than any threat Brenda had thrown at me. Fraud meant intent. Fraud meant knowledge. Fraud meant the rules they were hiding behind didn't protect them anymore. Thomas moved fast. He told me to stop responding directly to the HOA. No more explanations. No more calm conversations. From this point on, everything would move on paper and on record. We filed public records requests the same week, planning department emails, zoning discussions, contractor communications, budget approvals tied to the kiosk project, anything referencing the words reserve, access, monument, or easement. Thomas didn't ask for a little. He asked for everything. While that process started, the pressure outside didn't ease. If anything, it grew bolder. That was when the cameras paid off. It was close to midnight when my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I didn't rush. I didn't call anyone. I pulled the footage up slowly, watching infrared frames load one by one. 2 figures moved into view. One I recognized immediately. Evan Cole. He'd been around the property before, always with a vest and a clipboard, always claiming to be acting on behalf of the board. This time, there was no clipboard. He walked straight to the survey stakes near the concrete forms, knelt down, and pulled them out of the ground. He stomped the paint markings with his boot. He pried at the wooden forms like he was trying to shift them before the concrete fully cured. There was no confusion in his movements. No hesitation. This wasn't inspection. It was cleanup. I let the footage run. I zoomed in. I captured stills. I backed it up twice. I didn't confront him. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't step outside. I saved it. The next morning, a woman I barely knew knocked on my door. She introduced herself as a neighbor from 3 houses down. Her hands were shaking when she handed me a folded packet. Inside was a witness statement, pre-filled except for the signature line. It claimed I was aggressive, that I had threatened HOA representatives, that residents felt unsafe around my property. She told me the board had come by asking people to sign it so they could protect the community. She said it didn't feel right. I thanked her and asked if she would be willing to write her own statement about how she got the document. She said yes without hesitation. That was the moment the switch flipped. Up until then, I'd been handling this quietly, assuming facts would win on their own. But Brenda wasn't afraid of facts. She was afraid of exposure, and she was working hard to keep everything contained. I stopped playing private. With Thomas's guidance, I assembled an evidence packet the way cases are built, not the way complaints are made. Every document was labeled, every photo time-stamped, every email logged. The sabotage footage was clipped clean, no commentary, no edits that could be questioned. I included the original deed, the 1978 survey, the newer plat with the missing easement highlighted side by side. I included the violation notices with dates showing they were backdated. I included stills of Brenda on site during the concrete pour. I included the footage of Evan removing stakes at night. I added the unsigned witness statement and a written account from the neighbor who refused to sign it. No opinions. No insults, just a record. When it was done, I sat back and realized something I hadn't felt in weeks. Calm. Because for the first time since Brenda drove through my gate, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I was documenting a pattern. And once patterns are visible, they don't disappear when someone smiles or raises their voice. The letters went out on a Tuesday morning. Thomas helped draft them, but I signed every one. Cease and desist notices, mailed certified and hand-delivered were appropriate, each backed by citations instead of threats. They didn't accuse. They documented. They outlined the easement, referenced the recorded deed, cited criminal trespass statutes, and warned against further modification of the land without written consent. One copy went to the board. One went to the management company. One went to the contractors. And, at Thomas's suggestion, a plain language notice went to residents explaining why access along the road was restricted and why enforcement actions taken against me were unlawful. That last one did something Brenda hadn't planned for. Confusion spread fast. My phone started ringing with unfamiliar numbers. Neighbors stopped by the fence, not to argue, but to ask questions. Some brought copies of the letters they'd received from the HOA and asked why none of this had ever been mentioned before. A few apologized, quietly, embarrassed. They said they'd assumed the board knew what it was doing. I didn't celebrate that. I documented it. Emails followed, residents asking for copies of the deed. Residents asking why fines were being issued on land not owned by the HOA. Residents asking about the concrete slab. Brenda went silent. 2 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Maya Lynn, a regional reporter. She said someone had forwarded her footage. She asked if I'd be willing to explain what was happening on camera. I didn't rush. I asked her what she'd seen. She described the gate incidents. The concrete pour. The night footage of survey stakes being removed. She already knew enough to ask the right questions. We met at the fence line. I didn't rant. I didn't editorialize. I laid out the timeline the same way I had for Thomas. Maya filmed the documents, the slab, the gate still bent where Brenda had driven through it. She asked for comment from the HOA. They declined. The segment didn't air immediately, but the effect was already there. Brenda's authority depended on control of the narrative. Now the narrative had witnesses. The real breakthrough came quietly, the way solid evidence usually does. An older man named Harold Jensen knocked on my door late one afternoon. He introduced himself as a retired engineer who had worked on early infrastructure planning for Cedar Bluff before the HOA ever existed. He'd seen the letters, he'd watched the footage, and he recognized the problem immediately. Harold went home and came back with rolled-up blueprints yellowed at the edges. Original development plans, hand-drawn annotations, clear markings showing the easement as a fixed, known constraint that the subdivision had been designed around. "This was never a question," he said, tapping the page. "They knew it was there." I scanned and logged everything. A day later, I got an email from someone who asked to meet off-site. No phone calls, no messages through the HOA system. His name was Paul Richter, former treasurer. We met at a diner just outside town. Paul looked exhausted. He told me he'd resigned months earlier after raising concerns that went nowhere. He slid a flash drive across the table and said he couldn't watch this play out without saying something. The files were worse than I expected. Emails authorizing spending without resident votes. Invoices dated before approval meetings. Payments routed through a consulting firm that didn't exist beyond a registered name. The name on the registration belonged to Brenda's brother. The kiosk project wasn't just illegal land use. It was funded improperly, approved improperly, and designed to cement control over land they knew wasn't theirs. Paul didn't want attention. He wanted the record to be accurate. I thanked him and documented the transfer. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. Altered maps, trespass, sabotage, manufactured witness statements, misuse of funds, and now media attention. Brenda couldn't spin. That's when she made her move. A notice arrived from the court, filed under emergency relief. Brenda was seeking an injunction to force removal of my gate in Bollards, claiming they posed a public safety hazard and obstructed community access. The filing was rushed. The judge assigned was one Brenda mentioned casually in earlier conversations, back when she thought none of this would surface. Thomas read the notice once and smiled, thin and controlled. "She's panicking," he said. "And she's trying to win on procedure." We prepared our response, including a motion to disqualify for conflict, attaching the evidence Brenda hadn't expected anyone else to see. As I sealed the envelope, I realized something else. The trap wasn't snapping shut because I'd set it. It was closing because she couldn't stop stepping forward, convinced the system would protect her if she moved fast enough. And now, everything was on the record. The motion to disqualify landed faster than Brenda expected. Thomas filed it with attachments instead of rhetoric. Prior social ties. Overlapping events. Emails that showed familiarity where neutrality was required. The judge recused within 48 hours. No hearing. No explanation. Just a short order transferring the case to a neighboring county. That single page did more damage to Brenda's authority than any argument I could have made. Her confidence had been built on friendly rooms and predictable outcomes. When the venue changed, so did the tone of every message she sent afterward. Shorter, sharper, less certain. She tried to regain control the only way she knew how. The emergency HOA meeting notice went out that same night, marked urgent, attendance requested. It was scheduled for the community center, early evening, with security present for order. The phrasing alone told me she planned to turn it into a spectacle. I didn't plan to speak. I went because silence carries weight when the record is solid. The room was full before the meeting started. Folding chairs scraped across the floor. Neighbors stood along the walls. Phones were out, screens glowing low. The board sat up front behind a long table, name placards lined up like shields. Brenda took the center seat. She opened with procedural language, reminding everyone of decorum, authority, and the seriousness of the situation. She spoke about community safety, about obstruction, about legal threats from outside interests. Then she said my name. She accused me of blocking emergency access, of intimidating representatives, of creating liability for the neighborhood. She held up printed stills from my own footage, reframed as evidence of my aggression. That's when the room shifted. A woman stood up and asked why the easement wasn't disclosed when she bought her house. Another asked why fines were being issued on land the HOA didn't own. Someone else asked who approved the kiosk spending and why it wasn't voted on. Brenda tried to answer all of them at once. She talked faster. She cited the map. She deflected to legal counsel. Then one of the board members stood up and said he was resigning effective immediately. Another followed. A third asked for the minutes to reflect that she had raised concerns months earlier and been ignored. She resigned too. Brenda's face tightened. The smile she used when things went her way never came back. She pointed at me and accused me of manipulating the media, of turning neighbors against each other, of acting in bad faith. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The questions kept coming, sharper now. Residents asked why the consulting firm tied to the kiosk had no website, why invoices were dated before approval meetings, why the sheriff had been called so often without results. Brenda called for order. The room didn't give it. When the meeting finally adjourned, nothing had been resolved, but everything had changed. The board was fractured. The residents were awake, and Brenda no longer controlled the room she depended on. Outside, several neighbors stopped me. Some apologized. Some thanked me. Some just nodded, like people who finally understood they'd been standing on a lie. I went home and checked the final exhibits one more time. Thomas called to confirm the hearing date. Neutral court. Neutral judge. Full evidentiary schedule. Don't add anything, he said. It's complete. The morning of the hearing, the air felt different, not lighter, clearer. I arrived early and sat on the hard bench outside the courtroom, folder on my lap, hand steady. Brenda arrived with her attorney and didn't look at me. Her voice carried too loudly as she talked. Confidence pushed past its natural limit. When the bailiff opened the doors, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Everyone stood. I took a breath and walked in without a word, knowing that everything that needed to be said was already waiting on the record. The doors closed behind us, and the room went quiet. Brenda's attorney went first, confident in the way people get when they think momentum counts more than facts. He framed the case as a public safety emergency. He spoke about my gate like it was a barricade. He described the steel bollards as aggressive, dangerous, and deliberately provocative. He used phrases like hostile architecture and obstruction of emergency access. He pointed to printed photos, cropped tight, stripped of context, and argued that my actions put the entire community at risk. He talked for a long time without saying a single word about ownership. When he finished, the courtroom was quiet. Brenda sat behind him, chin lifted, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. She looked exactly like someone who expected the system to confirm what she already believed. Thomas stood without urgency. He didn't argue tone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't respond to the emotional framing at all. He walked to the lectern and began placing documents on the evidence stand one by one, letting the rhythm do the work. First came the deed. Recorded. Stamped. Filed decades before Cedar Bluff existed. Then the 1978 survey. Clear markings. The easement line unbroken, undeniable. Next, the overlays. Side-by-side comparisons that showed the easement intact in older records and missing in the newer plat. Thomas didn't accuse. He asked the court to notice the absence and the benefit created by that absence. The judge leaned forward. Thomas moved on to the footage. The gate incidents. Brenda driving through it. The concrete pour. Brenda on site, clipboard in hand, supervising work on land not owned by the association. The room shifted as the video played, the reality too clean to argue with. Then came the night footage. Infrared frames filled the screen. Evan Cole removing survey stakes. Damaging forms. Altering markings after the concrete had been poured. No uniforms, no inspection tools. Just intent. Brenda's attorney objected. Thomas responded calmly, citing timestamps and authentication. The objection was overruled. Thomas didn't look at Brenda when he introduced the next exhibits. Internal HOA emails discussing the easement as a problem. Language that suggested awareness, not confusion. Phrases like, "We need this resolved before construction," and "once the monument is in place, access becomes a non-issue." Then the financial records. Invoices dated before approvals. Payments routed through a consulting firm that didn't exist beyond paperwork. The firm's registration details tied directly to Brenda's brother. Thomas didn't speculate. He let the documents speak. Brenda shifted in her chair. The judge asked questions then. Direct ones. About notice. About authority. About how an HOA could approve construction on land it didn't own. Brenda's attorney tried to answer, stumbled, redirected. Brenda leaned over and whispered something sharp. Her attorney straightened, tried again, and failed to bridge the gap between narrative and record. The judge turned to Thomas and asked a single question. "What are you requesting at this stage?" Thomas answered without pause. "Denial of emergency relief. A protective order preventing further entry or modification of the easement. And discovery, including a forensic audit of HOA financials related to the project." The courtroom went still. Brenda shook her head, just once, barely noticeable. When the judge asked if she wished to speak, her attorney hesitated. Brenda nodded. She stood, clearly intending to reclaim the room the way she always had. She spoke about intention, about community good, about misunderstanding, about how none of this was meant to escalate. Halfway through, her voice cracked. Not loudly, just enough to betray what was underneath. She talked faster after that, trying to outrun the record that sat stacked and numbered in front of her. The judge let her finish. Then he ruled. Emergency relief denied. Protective order granted. No further entry onto the easement without my written permission. Discovery authorized. Forensic audit ordered, covering multiple years. Each sentence landed like a door closing. Brenda sat down slowly, the confidence draining out of her posture as if it had been holding her up. Her attorney stared at the table. The story they brought into the room no longer mattered. There was no shouting, no applause, no speech about justice, just the quiet authority of a record that had finally been allowed to speak. As the judge exited, the room remained still for a moment longer than usual. Then people stood. Chairs shifted. Conversation started low and cautious. Brenda didn't look at me as she left. She walked out with her head down, flanked by people who no longer knew how to help her. I gathered my papers and followed Thomas into the hallway. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Outside the courtroom, sunlight filtered through high windows, catching dust in the air. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized I was holding. The truth hadn't needed volume. It had just needed room. The weeks after the hearing moved slower, but they moved in one direction. The forensic audit did what clean records always do when they're examined closely. It exposed gaps. Then patterns. Then intent. Payments approved without votes. Invoices dated before meetings. Funds routed through a consulting firm that existed only on paper. By the time the findings were summarized, there was no room left for interpretation. Brenda was removed from the board permanently, not suspended. Not reassigned. Removed. Her name disappeared from newsletters and emails the same way my easement had once vanished from the map, only this time the record held. Cedar Bluff didn't try to rebrand or reshuffle. The association dissolved under the weight of its own paperwork. What remained was a maintenance-only district, stripped of enforcement powers, focused on landscaping and shared utilities instead of control. The concrete came out on a clear morning. Jackhammers broke the slab into pieces small enough to carry away. Dust rose and settled. The ground beneath was scarred but intact. County surveyors recertified the easement that same week, placing permanent markers at each boundary point so no one could pretend not to see it again. I watched from the fence line as the last chunk was hauled off, the space opening back up like it had been holding its breath. Rebuilding the gate was my next job. I didn't rush it. I replaced bent steel with clean lines, reinforced the hinges, and anchored the posts deeper than before. The steel bollards stayed, not as a threat, but as clarity. They marked the boundary plainly, without argument. Neighbors started coming back slowly. Some brought food. Some brought help. Most brought apologies. They told me they'd trusted the board. They told me they didn't know. I listened, because most of them meant it. Lily walked the road again without asking if it was allowed. She stopped worrying about trucks and strangers and letters taped to the fence. The land returned to what it had always been: work, routine, and quiet. The camera stayed up. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Documentation doesn't mean expecting trouble. It means being prepared for it. What stayed with me most wasn't the courtroom or the audit or the headlines. It was how quickly authority collapsed once it was forced to explain itself. How much power had been borrowed from silence and assumption, and how little of it survived daylight. I didn't win by shouting. I didn't win by matching pressure with pressure. I won by letting the record speak when someone tried to rewrite it. A clipboard can intimidate. A smile can mislead. But documentation outlasts both. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?